we are talking about ventilation and essentially including more fresh air or standards of ASHRAE for indoor air quality, we are talking typically about what we would call average values. So in other words, you're assuming that that space is well mixed, homogeneous. And so if you were to release a number of our particles, that they would be homogeneously mixed in that space, diluted homogeneously in that space. And that's really where the work that we've been doing, really focusing on the fluid flow processes that take place, become important. Because in most spaces, particularly when you're starting to talk about occupancies, but even in regular buildings that have not cranked up their venting to really ensure or tested that the layout and the venting enable to have such homogeneous mixing at rates that are sufficiently high to lower the infection particle exposure. So essentially in most schools, in fact, it is not homogeneous. So you have pockets potentially of accumulation induced by simply the lack of optimization of the venting, but also where the individuals are positioned. So that is true for all sorts of reasons. But the part that you are referring to about hot zones, particularly on inlets and outlets, is the critical hot spots that I really wanted to highlight, because we are recommending to increase the air changes, or essentially the portion of clean air that we are injecting at high rates, to compensate for the ventilation indoor that might not be at standard, or might not be to the standard that we would wish to have for infection control. So when we are recommending that, typically we have different strategies. One of it is to essentially use natural ventilation, essentially opening windows or doors to create currents that will locally inject more airflow and directional flows, and in some location, either essentially in a door or window, and locally expulse the contaminated air from another outlet. So that's one strategy. Another strategy that we're recommending is to complement the airflow injection by having essentially the creation of airflow with devices that are localized, like an air filter, a HEPA air filter, that you would add on to the building venting that is already in place to complement and in fact augment the air changes. That too creates localized flow patterns that can be relatively strong depending on the strength of the airflow that we're setting and the device that we're using. So that's why I really wanted to focus then on what are the implications also of these recommendations, and so that when we're trying to essentially advise people to do this to improve the situation, we avoid creating potentially these hot spots that could then also have secondary effects. And so it's simple principles. You don't need to do a full detailed calculation for all of it, but simple principles that people should keep in mind when doing this. Because you would be injecting fresh airflow, or you would be essentially removing contaminated airflow from a localized zone that is at the height essentially of the occupants, if we're talking about a window or an air filter that is either on the floor or on a table, we are creating potentially directional, strong airflows toward that entry point or exit point, whether it's a device or a window or a door. That creates, therefore, concentration areas where, if we're talking about the outlet, where all the air of the room, not all of it, but a big portion, higher portion than otherwise prior to that intervention, could essentially be directed. So essentially an individual that would be sitting too close to such exit point would be cumulatively over time exposed to more bioparticles than the average without, first of all, that device, that position, and individual sitting there, but also on average from the other occupants. So that is why I wanted to really make sure to highlight that, because that just means that intervention is still good to have, because it does increase the air changes in the room. It's very important to do that to lower the average. But because we don't have homogeneous mixing, and we potentially have disturbance of the airflow patterns by adding these points of fresh air input or output, we need to then ensure that we do not place within a certain radius, rule of thumb, the 1 to 2 meters for most air, for example, cleaners, close to that exit point or that suction point of the air filter. Similarly for the windows and the doors, because for the exit points. For the entry points, Of course, there could be benefit for the individual to be right there, to be exposed to the very clean, fresh air that's coming from the outside or a device. The issue is if one of those individuals, in fact, become infected, even, for example, asymptomatic, then because of the again, directional strong airflow that is coming out of that point, we would have a very effective, now concentrated, if you will, plume that would be extended from that individual. So similarly, in the exit points or the entry points, we shouldn't have sitting so that we avoid these scenarios of higher global exposure or very effective pattern of contamination in the wake of the individuals in question.